In the early morning hours, before the sun peaked above the jagged horizon, the air in the Wild West was often cooler than expected, but that chill would not last. The wooden floorboards of a poorly built shack creaked under the weight of a waking settler, stiff from sleeping on a mattress filled with straw and rodent droppings. There was no electricity to light the room, no plumbing to wash the face, no button to press for warmth or cool air. Only the silence of isolation, broken occasionally by the restless bray of a donkey, or the shuffling of a snake in the dirt. If you were living in a frontier town or worse, on the outskirts of one, your day began not with breakfast, but with fire. Without it, there could be no warmth, no water, no food. Gathering kindling was a daily ritual. Dry twigs were not easy to come by in the dusty, cracked terrain of Arizona or New Mexico, and once the flame caught, it was precious, guarded like gold. The stove rusted and smudged with soot might take an hour or more just to get warm enough to cook something modest, like a few beans or cornmeal if you were lucky. Food scarcity was constant. A single biscuit could be all you had for the day. Coffee, when it existed, was often reused, brewed from grounds so many times that it resembled little more than bitter, hot water. Meat was rare unless you hunted it yourself. And hunting was not a luxury pastime. It meant traveling miles with a musket or revolver in hand, tracking animals, risking snake bite, starvation, or ambush. And even if you caught something, there was no guarantee your meat would last. Without refrigeration, everything had to be smoked or salted. Even then, insects found it quickly. The roads, if you could call them, that were narrow paths of dirt and dried mud. Ruts formed by wagon wheels made travel dangerous. Wheels broke, axles snapped, and walking was slow, brutal, and dehydrating. Boots wore down in weeks, and the soles of your feet blistered and tore under the pressure of the terrain. Dust coated everything, your clothes, your lungs, your tongue. Every breath you took stirred the fine sand into your nostrils, mixing with sweat and the sour taste of survival. Towns were not lively places of trade and excitement. They were often scattered collections of shacks and tents, temporary in their construction and fragile in their purpose. Saloons were less like glamorous dance halls and more like dark rooms of stale beer and tired men, many of whom were sick, dying, or dangerous. Sanitation did not exist in any formal sense. Human waste was often tossed outside into shallow pits or allowed to fester nearby. Flies were everywhere. The smell of rotting food, sweat, and decay clung to every surface. Disease spread silently and quickly. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera stalked settlements, and the idea of hygiene was a luxury people rarely discussed, let alone practiced. And then there were people, desperate, rugged, and suspicious. Trust was not easily given. Arguments over land, cattle, water rights, or even insults turned violent swiftly. Guns were not just symbols, they were tools of survival, but they were inaccurate, slow to reload, and often misfired. Being shot in the Wild West wasn't dramatic. It was usually fatal. There were no trained doctors, and even those who claimed the title often had no real knowledge of medicine. Amputation was common. Whiskey was the anesthetic. Infection followed, and death came slowly. Even children were not spared the grind of frontier life. They worked from sunup to sundown, fetching water, feeding animals, helping in the fields, learning to trap, sew, cook, clean, and survive. There were no toys, no playgrounds, no rest, just the awareness that every day was a fight against nature, hunger, and the unknown. The sun, once risen, became a harsh judge. It scorched the earth, blistered skin, and made even the smallest task, walking to the well, feel like an expedition. Water had to be drawn by hand, often from a contaminated source. Many settlers didn't boil it, either because they didn't know to or couldn't afford the fuel to keep a fire burning long enough. The result was endless bouts of sickness, cramps, diarrhea, vomiting, weakness. But life didn't stop. You still had to haul wood, feed animals, mend fences, and try not to collapse. You wouldn't have had a clock to tell the time. Time was judged by the sun and the habits of animals. Days blurred together, with nothing marking the hours except chores and aches. The idea of leisure was foreign. Even Sunday was not restfully, was often reserved for laundry, repairs, or walking miles to a church. If there even was one. As the sun dipped low again, the temperature dropped sharply. The sweat of the day turned cold against your skin. Clothes, wool, canvas, or leather, were stiff and itchy, and sleep. That was a reward you earned through pain. Nights were full of howls, wolves, coyotes, drunken fights, and coughing from nearby cabins. A creaking door could mean a thief, or worse. A passing stranger might be a preacher, a trader, or someone hoping to steal your only possessions, and you'd likely lie awake, heart pounding, wondering if you'd make it through the night without food, fire, or water. Your body sore, your stomach empty, and your hands raw from a day's work that would start again tomorrow. No doctors, no police, no safety net, only the will to survive and the land, which did not care if you lived or died. That was just one day, and you wouldn't last it. The second day in the Wild West offered no relief. If the first taught you that survival was a constant test of endurance, the second taught you repetition. Every action had to be done again. The same aching muscles were required to haul the same buckets of water. The same cracking hands had to split more wood. Tools were few, and they broke easily. Iron rusted fast in dry heat and faster in rare storms. There was no hardware store within walking distance. And if you were lucky enough to be in a settlement that had one, the prices could be so high as to be unreachable. A single nail might cost a meal, a hammer might cost two, and so you made do. Repaired with twine, with animal sinew, with scrap. A hoe could be bound together with strips of hide, and a cracked pot could be patched with clay. But everything had a time limit, and every object was in a slow process of decay. Just like people, if your clothes tore, you mended them with whatever thread you could unravel from another garment. If your boots lost their soles, you stuffed grass inside. Some people walked barefoot for days, until their feet hardened or bled, whichever came first. A hat wide-brimmed and sun-faded was not just decoration, it was armor against heat stroke. And if the wind caught it, you chased it. You always chased it. Horses were rare and valuable. If you didn't have one, you walked for miles across dry land that cracked underfoot. Rattlesnakes basked in silence on warm rocks, and scorpions nested under debris. Every footstep could mean pain. In the Wild West, even standing still could hurt. For many, the only income came from trapping or trade. Animal pelts were currency. Fur traders bought beaver, fox, wolf, and muskrat hides. But trapping was slow and unreliable. Traps had to be baited and set carefully. They might catch nothing. Or worse, they might catch something too large to handle. Coyotes in packs, mountain lions roaming silently through brush, and wild boars with tusks that could gut a man in seconds. Those who didn't trap might try to pan for gold or silver in riverbeds. But the gold rush stories were mostly myths by the time most settlers arrived. The surface gold was gone, and what remained was deep underground, needing tools and teams and time. Instead, most found silt and rock, hours spent crouched over freezing water, squinting at dirt, only to go home with nothing, or less than nothing, chilled, sick, and discouraged. Law was as scattered as the people. A town might have a sheriff, or it might not. The sheriff might be respected, or feared, or absent entirely. Often, justice was decided by the people, and that meant mob action, lynching, or revenge. A stolen horse could result in hanging. A drunken insult could lead to a bullet in the chest. And if you were falsely accused, there was little recourse. The burden of proof was not legal, it was personal. Letters, if they came at all, arrived after months. Postal routes were long and dangerous. Riders could be attacked. Mail was lost to floods, to fire, to theft. News was old by the time it reached you, and it was rarely good. A relative lost to fever, a drought back home, a war somewhere far away that somehow still affected prices in your little town. You might have owned a rifle, a musket, maybe a revolver. Ammunition was costly and not something to waste. You didn't shoot for sport. Every shot counted, and misfiring was common. Guns jammed, cracked, or failed. When they worked, they kicked hard, left bruises, burst. Eardrums set dry grass on fire. The smell of gunpowder stayed on your clothes and in your lungs. If you were wounded even slightly, your life changed. A small cut could become infected, a splinter might fester, a toothache could turn fatal, and toothaches were common. Sugar, when available, destroyed enamel quickly, and toothbrushes were rare. Some people used charcoal, others chewed twigs. Most simply endured. When the pain grew unbearable, teeth were pulled by blacksmiths, bartenders, or anyone with pliers. And a strong arm, no sedation, no antiseptic. Just pain and bleeding and silence. The silence, in fact, was often the loudest thing. There was no hum of machines, no distant traffic, no radios, no clocks ticking on walls. Only the wind, the distant creak of wood, the call of a hawk, or the soft approach of something you couldn't see. You listened closely in the Wild West, because everything was a clue. Sound told you what direction a storm was coming from, what kind of animal was nearby, whether someone approached your home, or your livestock. Because theft wasn't just inconvenient, it could end you. A stolen horse meant immobility. A stolen rifle meant helplessness. A stolen bag of flour meant hunger. Every person you met was a gamble. Were they just passing through, or scouting your possessions? Were they friendly, or just pretending? You never knew, not truly. And trust was like currency spent slowly and carefully. If you had children, they grew up fast. Childhood ended at walking age. Boys learned to ride, trap, shoot. Girls learned to sew, grind corn, fetch water, and bury the dead. Death was not hidden from children. They saw it early, often. Smallpox, scarlet fever, that struck quickly, left marks, and carried siblings away. Graves were dug shallow, and sometimes reused. And yet people stayed. They built lives out of cracked boards, nailed together with rusting iron. They married in small churches or under the sky. They read by lantern light. They worked without question. Some even laughed. But the cost of every smile was high. You, soft-handed and clean, would have noticed every pain magnified. The burn of sun on your neck, the hunger pangs by noon, the aching feet by nightfall, the longing for safety, for clean water, for a locked door that meant something. But there were no locks that truly worked in the Wild West, just the weight of what you carried, and whether you had the strength to carry it again the next day. And you would have asked yourself, quietly, if it was all worth it. But the West didn't answer, it never did. As the third day in the Wild West began, the first signs of wear had already sunk into your body and mind. The morning air was dry, almost sharp, and your lips were cracked from the previous day's heat. Your eyes burned from the dust, your back ached from the rough bedding, and your hands blistered and raw were slower now, less responsive. But rest was not something the West offered easily. Morning meant movement, always. The land itself demanded that you rise before the sun did, and begin again. The cattle had to be checked, if you had any. Most didn't. Those who did lived in constant fear of theft, sickness, or drought. Cattle could die in a single night, struck by lightning, bitten by snakes, or taken by coyotes. A broken leg from uneven terrain meant the end for a steer, and for you, that might mean the loss of your winter food, your only income, or both. And so, even before breakfast, if there was breakfast, you walked the dry field, watched for hoofprints, checked fences, counted shadows. If you were or a drifter working someone else's land, your morning started with movement, saddling up a horse, if one was available, or walking for miles with spurs that jingled, not out of style, but necessity. Spurs helped with stubborn animals, and they were heavy, clunky. They rubbed your ankles raw. You'd ride out or walk long, into the open nothing, your job not to relax, but to find what had escaped, what had gone missing, or what had gone wrong. By the third day, your stomach might have turned on itself. The food you brought westwards, halted pork, hardtack, beans, was either gone or tasteless. Hardtack especially was less a food and more a test. It could break teeth. It had to be soaked in water or coffee before eating, if you didn't want to bleed from the gums. And still, many people did. For women, the third day brought no fewer burdens. A settler's wife, daughter, or sister was a worker above all else. There were no store-bought clothes, only garments you made by hand or remade from scraps. Laundry meant hauling water, boiling it with soap made from lye and ash, scrubbing cloth against rough boards until your knuckles bled. And laundry was a luxury, not a routine. Many went weeks wearing the same clothes, and so did you. The days blurred together, hot and dry, or cold and dry, or windy and dry. And the wind, especially in the plains, was relentless. It carried dust in waves, fine enough to slip through walls, windows, mouths, and eyes. It stung. It dried out your food. It whispered constantly, making sleep harder. Sand and dust collected on your floorboards, your dishes, your lungs. Some children developed what would now be called asthma, but there were no inhalers, no medicine, only the slow, wheezing breath and the hope it would pass. If you were religious, and most were, in some way, then Sunday might be your only structured day. If there was a preacher nearby, services were held in barns or under canvas tents. Hymns were sung with cracked voices, and sermons warned of hellfire, which for many seemed no different than the dry, hot land they already walked. Bibles were among the most common books, and many people could quote them more easily than they could tell the days of the week, not because they were uneducated, but because they were exhausted. Education, when it happened, was basic. A schoolhouse, if it existed, was usually one room, one teacher, many students of different ages, a few slates, some chalk, maybe a primer. Lessons were interrupted by weather, by sickness, by need. Children had to leave mid-year to help with planting or harvest. Some never returned. Education was a dream, often buried beneath the weight of survival. Trade was awkward and inconsistent. You might go weeks without seeing a peddler. When one came, he might offer needles, spices, maybe dried fruit, buttons, boots, or news from the East. Prices varied wildly. You bartered more than you bought. A good chicken might be worth a tin of coffee. A pair of boots might be traded for a sack of potatoes. If you had neither, you watched others trade. And you waited. Animals were both companions and liabilities. A mule could carry supplies, but it could also collapse from overwork or thirst. Dogs were loyal, but needed food too, and they barked at everything. Wind, rustling leaves, distant. Coyotes. Chickens brought eggs when healthy. When not, they brought disease. Rabies, distemper, foot rottleness in animals often meant illness in humans. There were no veterinarians. You guessed what to do. Sometimes you guessed wrong. On the third night, your fatigue deepened. Muscles twitched involuntarily. Sleep did not come easy, and when it did, it came hard, leaving you groggy and slower when the sun returned. You dreamed of cool rivers, of soft beds, of voices that weren't panicked or shouting. You woke to silence, then the rising sound of insects and rustling wind. The Wild West had no mercy for weariness. People grew older faster here. A man of 30 might look 50. A woman of 40 had gray hair and deep lines around her mouth. Skin was damaged by sun and wind. Joints swelled from overuse. Eyes squinted constantly, reading the land. Even laughter was low and brief, stolen from the mouth of exhaustion. You might wonder by now why anyone stayed, why people came west at all. The truth was, many didn't mean to stay. They came in hope, in desperation, in pursuit of something better. Land, perhaps, or distance. Some fled debts, or shame, or war. Some were promised prosperity that never came, but once they arrived, it was too hard to leave, and so they stayed, and worked, and broke, and survived. You, still in your third day, were already asking how many more you could endure, and the answer, quietly, without drama, remained, not many. On the fourth day in the Wild West, something changed, but not for the better. You began to lose your sense of time, not because the days weren't distinct, but because they were all too similar. The sun rose in the same pale haze, the horizon stretched out in the same dull golden brown, and the wind had that same scratchy voice in your ears, soft but never silent. Time didn't feel like progress anymore. It felt like weight, a heaviness pressing down, and in this weight, routines became burdens. The small tasks you had learned just days earlier began to feel monumental. Lighting a fire in the morning took longer. Your hands trembled slightly from a combination of poor sleep and too little nourishment. Bread was hard, water lukewarm, beans metallic and bland. You still chewed, because chewing meant something warm would enter your body, but you no longer tasted it. The effort itself was just another job. Your body wasn't the only thing changing. Your mind was beginning to shift. Silence became uncomfortable, not peaceful. Every creak in the wood, every distant animal cry, every rustle in the brush made you stop and listen. The Wild West wasn't empty. It was full of life, death, accidents, and consequences. You started to notice the details. The way the sun cracked the ground until it resembled broken porcelain. The way a single cloud could move across the sky like a slow threat. The way vultures circled for hours without rest. And yet, for all that attention, your ability to act didn't improve. A simple chore, pairing a broken wagon wheel, fetching water, cutting kindling took hours. Sweat clung to your neck. The dry air pulled it away quickly, but the exhaustion lingered. You looked around, but there was no one to help. Most people were too busy to assist anyone else. In the Wild West, survival was mostly solitary. You may have walked into a town again, if one was nearby. Towns varied. Some had only a single saloon and a blacksmith. Others had a general store, a post office, and maybe even a doctor, though doctor could mean many things. Training was optional in frontier medicine. A man with a book and a saw might call himself a surgeon. He might amputate a leg one day and deliver a baby the next. Anesthesia was a rag soaked in whiskey. Instruments were reused. If infection followed, it was expected. If you survived, you were lucky. If not, you were buried with little ceremony. In the saloon, the air was thick with smoke. Pipes and cigars and cheap tobacco hung in the air like fog. Cards were shuffled with stained fingers, and coins clinked against worn wooden tables. A drink might cost more than a full meal, but many paid it. Alcohol dulled pain, quieted nerves, blurred fear, but it also started fights. Loud ones, messy ones, quick ones. You may have seen someone thrown through swinging doors, or worse, most towns had no jail. If you caused trouble, the townsfolk might deal with you themselves. The saloon, girls, often called so casually, had their own burdens. Many had no choices left. Some were orphans. Some had been left behind. Some had come west with dreams, then found themselves trapped by economics, by threats, or by illness. They smiled because it paid better than silence. But behind the smile was exhaustion, just like yours. Their day never really ended, only dimmed. Gambling was another regular sight. Dice games, card tables, coin tosses, all fast ways to lose the little you had. Some gambled their land, some their horses, some their guns, and some their lives. You learned quickly not to look too long at another man's hand, not to speak out of turn, and never to accuse anyone of cheating unless you were prepared to. Finish what followed. Outside the town, the landscape still ruled over everything. Dust storms could arrive without warning. The sky would darken in midday, and the air would become solid, almost alive. You couldn't breathe during one. You couldn't open your eyes. If you didn't cover your mouth and nose, you choked. If you didn't find shelter, you were flayed by wind and grit. And when it passed, you emerged covered in red-brown earth, coughing, and uncertain what had been damaged while you waited. Your clothes, already torn and stiff with sweat, now bore permanent stains. You'd stopped caring how you looked. Survival had nothing to do with appearance. It had to do with what you could carry, how far you could walk, and whether your boots held up another day. Most boots didn't. You tied them together with string, with animal sinew, with bits of old cloth. There was no pride in the Wild West, just grit and noise. You learned a few things, slowly, that coyotes always howled just before the temperature dropped at night, that crows were better than maps. They gathered where there was life, or where there had been death, that you never sat with your back to the door, that a friendly stranger might just be someone who hasn't decided yet whether to rob you. The fourth night was colder than the others. Heat in the west didn't last. It could be blistering during the day, then freezing just after sunset. You wrapped yourself in a blanket that smelled of smoke and old sweat. Your fingers were numb. The fire you built was small, just enough to keep away predators, but not so large as to attract humans. The line between protection and invitation was thin and deadly. Lying on the hard ground, your thoughts moved slowly. Your dreams blurred with memories. You might have dreamt of home, of running water, of clean clothes. Or maybe you didn't dream at all. Maybe you just floated in the dark, too tired to sleep, too sore to move, too wary to fully close your eyes. Because in the Wild West, even sleep had to be earned. And even then, it never came gently. By the 5th day, your body had adjusted only slightly to the constant discomfort. But adjusted didn't mean comfortable, it meant resigned. Pain became ordinary. Blisters no longer stung unless they tore open. Sore muscles no longer caused alarm, just slower movement. Hunger became familiar, a background rhythm rather than an urgent need. Your stomach rumbled, but your focus had narrowed to simpler goals: fire, water, shelter, and not being noticed by the wrong kind of people. Water, especially, became a constant concern. You had no running taps, no cold streams nearby. Most settlers and wanderers drank from whatever source they could find: shallow creeks, animal troughs, hand-dug wells. Water might be muddy, stagnant, full of insects, or worse. Sometimes it tasted of iron, or salt, or death. People boiled what they could, when they had time. But time wasn't always an option. Sometimes thirst won over caution. And when it did, sickness often followed. Dysentery, typhoid, and cholera were common among Western travelers. The symptoms started small, just cramps, a headache, maybe dizziness. They grew quickly. Dehydration set in faster than anyone expected, especially under the dry sun. There were no hospitals, just beds, or floorboards, or wagons where the sick lay wrapped in blankets that couldn't keep them warm. You learned to avoid the sick if you could. If not, you simply hoped your turn hadn't come yet. If you were part of a wagon train, the 5th day might have meant another 30 miles of slow, uneven travel. Wheels creaked endlessly. Hooves thudded into dry dirt. Every bump jolted your bones. If someone in your group broke a leg, person, or animal lid, meant stopping for the day. If a wheel cracked, the group fell behind. If a child cried too long, it drew attention from wild animals or wild men. And so people learned to be silent, learned to endure. The 5th day was like the 4th, only with more miles behind and fewer supplies ahead. If you had livestock, they were always a step from death. Cows needed grazing land, but grass was scarce. Chickens needed grain, but that ran out fast. Horses, though vital for travel, could easily be lamed. A limp could become a death sentence. And when an animal died, it wasn't mourned, it was skinned, processed, and stripped of use. Bones became tools. Hide became rope. Nothing was wasted, because everything had to serve a purpose. Around this time, you might have seen your first real confrontation. Not a brawl in a saloon, but a dispute between settlers over land, water, or suspicion. A neighbor might accuse another of trespassing, or stealing fence posts, or poisoning a well. Words could be exchanged, then shovels, then guns. Arguments didn't take long to escalate. Law enforcement was thin, and justice was often personal. You kept your head low, your eyes averted, your voice down. Guns were tools more than weapons, but they were never far from reach. Almost everyone owned one. Pistols, rifles, shotguns, some polished and passed down from older generations, others rusty and used more as deterrents than instruments of violence. You learned not to touch another person's gun, not to ask to see it, not to look at it too long. In the Wild West, perceived disrespect could end in blood. Mail was rare and slow. Letters might arrive weeks or months late. If they arrived at all, paper was valuable. Ink was precious. Writing was usually brief, formal, and sparse. Alive, well, need help, or coming home. Sometimes, you received a letter about someone who had died long before it reached you. There was no time to grieve fully. Life didn't pause for loss. It barely paused for breath. The 5th evening came with clouds, but no promise of rain. Weather teased the west often. The sky would darken, wind would rise, but the ground stayed dry. When storms did come, They arrived with lightning and violence, not gentle relief. Thunder cracked open the silence. Horses spooked, trees split, people stayed indoors, if they had doors. If not, they hid in cellars, or under carts, or behind rocks. Shelter was always incomplete. A leak here, a draft there. Something missing, something rotting, something broken. As you tried to sleep on the fifth night, the quiet was sharper, less comforting. Coyotes howled again. An owl called from a nearby tree. Something, maybe a raccoon, maybe something larger, scratched near your supplies. You sat up once, unsure if what you heard was real or dream. The fire was low, just embers. Too much wood, wasted fuel. Too little invited darkness. You stared into the red-orange glow and waited. You thought about your feet, swollen and stiff. About your back, hunched from lifting and walking. About the salt crusted on your clothes. You thought about home, if you had one. About warmth, and regular meals, and people who didn't speak with suspicion in their eyes. Then you realized how far away those thoughts were now. How strange comfort seemed. How long ago it had been normal. On the fifth day, you didn't plan for the future. You didn't think about building a new life or starting a ranch or striking it rich. You thought about tomorrow, whether you'd have enough water, whether your boots would hold, whether you'd be left alone. And slowly, quietly, you accepted that this was what people called life out west. Not adventure, not romance. Just heat, dust, silence, and the small victories that kept you alive one day more. The sixth day in the Wild West began before sunrise. Most days did, not because of discipline or preference, but because there was no choice. The land made demands, and those demands came early. The wind outside rustled through coarse brush. Your eyes opened to a sky still black, your breath faintly visible in the cold morning air. It was always colder than expected, just before the sun came up, and you could feel the ground beneath you hard, uneven, and unwelcoming beneath the thin blanket you had stopped adjusting during the night. The first task of the day was always fuel. Without fire, there was no warmth, no food, no safety. But wood wasn't always nearby. In some regions, trees were rare, and kindling meant dried animal dung, brittle brush, or broken fence pieces. You crouched near the old fire pit and coaxed a flame from last night's embers. Smoke rose in thin columns as the fire came alive. You felt no pride in the act, just necessity. Breakfast, if it happened, was whatever remained. A bit of jerky, some beans, reheated, dry cornmeal, boiled into a tasteless mush. Coffee, if you were lucky, strong, bitter, black as tar. It wasn't comfort, it was fuel. A way to wake your mind and move your limbs. You didn't linger. There was no reason to. By the sixth day, you had learned what not to expect. You no longer expected help. No longer expected fairness. No longer expected relief. The West didn't hand out favors. If your tools broke, you fixed them. If your horse limped, you walked. If your hand bled, you wrapped it and kept moving. If you couldn't move, you stayed behind, and, in many cases, that meant the end. The people you encountered had their own burdens, their own scars, and their own unspoken rules. You learned not to ask too many questions. Where a man came from, why a woman traveled alone, why someone never smiled. These things were left unsaid. Silence was often safer than words, and for many, silence was all they had left. You passed by a small homestead late in the morning. A sod house, walls made from earth and grass. The roof sagged in places, patched with animal hides and canvas. Smoke drifted weakly from a metal pipe. A child stared from behind a dirty window, expression blank. They didn't wave, they didn't smile, just watched. This was the face of survival. Not innocence, not wonder, just fatigue, sharpened by dust and hunger. The midday sun rose again with that familiar heat. It wasn't the sharp heat of the desert, but the slow, steady drain that came from standing under an open sky for hours. Your shirt stuck to your back, sweat gathered on your forehead, then vanished, stolen by the dry wind. You could feel the weight of the sun in your bones. Even the insects seemed slower. You found a bit of shade under a wagon, behind a rock, but it brought little relief. The heat still pressed down, the air still tasted of dust, The trail was littered with reminders of failure: broken wagon wheels, split barrels, scraps of clothing, bones, animal or human bleached by the sun. These were not rare. They were constant. The land offered no mercy for misjudgment. A bad crossing, a wrong turn, a storm at the wrong hour. Any of these could unravel a life completely, and then someone else, like you, would walk past and see the remains, and keep walking. At a trading post, if you were near one, the people were not cheerful merchants. They were tired men with cracked hands and guarded eyes. Items were limited: salt, flour, nails, tobacco, bullets. Prices were high. No one haggled loudly, no one smiled much. Everyone understood the terms. Survival had a cost. If you didn't have money, you traded labor. If you had nothing to trade, you moved on. You met a man by the post who claimed to be a map maker. His maps were small, drawn in pencil on ragged paper. They were mostly guesses, patched together from memory, warnings, and old stories. The man said rivers ran here, hills rose there. He couldn't guarantee any of it. The land shifted, paths vanished, trails were swallowed by storms. You might buy a map, but you didn't trust it. It was better than nothing, but not by much. Later in the afternoon, the wind picked up. Not enough for a storm, but enough to carry the smell of cattle, of cooking fat, of dried blood. You passed what used to be a camp. Torn canvas flapped in the wind. Ashes scattered across the dirt. No people remained. Maybe they moved on. Maybe something moved them. You didn't ask. You didn't linger. You just tightened your pack and kept walking. The sixth evening came with little warning. In the west, sunset arrived with speed. One moment the land glowed red and gold. The next, it fell into shadow. Fires flickered to life again. The wind grew colder. The insects grew bolder. Coyotes sang to one another from opposite hills. You ate in silence. Your hands trembled slightly. Not from fear had dulled, but from depletion. You thought about rest, but rest didn't come easy. You slept lightly, aware of the sounds around you. Boots on dry dirt, horses snorting, wood crackling, footsteps too quiet to trust. You didn't know if you would make it through another night. But then, you hadn't known that since the first day. And yet, like all who stayed, you carried on, not out of hope, not out of strength, but because there was nothing else to do. The land didn't wait. The west didn't stop. And you discovered, half-starved and sore, moved forward with the slow rhythm of someone who had begun to forget what it felt like to be clean, to be rested, or to be safe. By the seventh day, your body had begun to forget comfort entirely. Your skin was dry, cracked along the knuckles, and sunburned where fabric didn't reach. You hadn't looked in a mirror since you arrived in the West, and if you did now, you might not recognize yourself. Dirt clung to every crease of your face. Your eyes were red from dust and wind. Your lips were split from lack of water and too much wind. You no longer noticed the smell on your clothes, because everything around you smelled the same: of animals, of smoke, of unwashed bodies, and of the land itself. The morning was cold again, but less surprising than before. You woke slowly, hearing the quiet shuffle of wind through grass, and the distant creak of a wooden structure. You wrapped your blanket around your shoulders, and squatted near the fire pit, already used up from the night. Embers glowed beneath ash. You pushed a few sticks close, watched the flame rise just enough to boil a tin of water and warm your hands. You didn't speak. There was no one to speak to. On this day, you had hoped to reach a town again. A place with real buildings and the smell of bread, perhaps. Or at least a place where people moved slowly and not always with suspicion. The road, however, didn't make that easy. Roads were not always marked. The West had no signs, and trails faded. Often, sometimes, wagon ruts helped you find your way. Sometimes, they led to nothing. You followed instinct, or luck. You crossed a dry creek bed before noon. The stones there were smooth from centuries of flow that had long since disappeared. Someone had carved initials into a boulder, M.E. 1854, and next to it, a crude cross. No story was written, but you understood. Someone died here, maybe by thirst, maybe something worse. No one was buried deep in dry ground. Most graves were shallow, hastily covered, if at all, and animals always came eventually. Midday brought stillness. Even the birds disappeared in the heat. The air didn't move. Your clothes stuck again, but this time not just from sweat from grime. Your shirt, once white, had become the color of old parchment. The soles of your boots had thinned. Your socks, if you still had them, were threadbare. You wrapped your feet in rags and leather scraps, hoping for one more day before they split entirely. You passed a prospector sitting alone on a hillside. He had no horse, no hat, just a rusted pan and an empty stare. He said nothing as you walked past, didn't nod, didn't blink. You couldn't tell how long he'd been there, or if he was still looking for gold, or if he ever had dream of wealth, had drawn many men west, but few found it. Most just found dust, sickness, and time running out. By afternoon you found a set of abandoned buildings, maybe a ghost town, maybe a camp left behind. There was a saloon with doors hanging crooked, a well dry and half filled with wind-blown leaves, a few crates and barrels, all empty. No voices, no signs of struggle, just absence. The windows were broken. The floors sagged under your weight. You sat for a while in the saloon, your back against a cracked wall, staring at the dust motes in the sunbeam. In places like this, silence was louder than noise. You could feel the memories in the walls, not good ones, not stories of laughter or song, but of waiting. Long hours of nothing, long years of survival. People didn't vanish in the West all at once. They faded, left without announcement, left behind things, but not themselves. By early evening, you reached the edge of a canyon. The path dipped sharply. You could see a river far below, winding between red cliffs, its sound faint but steady. This was the first running water you'd seen in days. You scrambled down carefully, feet slipping on loose rock, hands grasping for roots. When you reached the bank, you drank without speaking, your knees deep in the cold stream. It tasted like life, mineral rich, clean enough, with a bite of cold that reminded you what water was supposed to feel like. You bathed your face, washed your hands, sat with your boots off, feet in the stream. For a few minutes it felt like peace, but it didn't last. The sun was setting fast, and you had to climb back up. You couldn't sleep in the canyon, too exposed, too dangerous. So you wrapped wet cloths around your arms and climbed again, this time slower. Every muscle ached. You weren't injured, but you were tired in a way that didn't go away with rest that night. The sky was clearer than you remembered. Stars appeared one by one, then in clusters. You lay on your back, wrapped in your smoke-stained blanket, staring upward. The wind was gentler, the fire small and steady. Coyotes were distant tonight. No footsteps approached. No one spoke. Thought about other travelers, those who had walked this same road, who had slept on the same hard ground. How many had turned back? How many had disappeared? How many had made it to a town, bought land, built a house? You didn't know, and you couldn't imagine it clearly, because on the seventh night, it still didn't feel like life. It felt like surviving between sleep and waking, like floating between places that didn't remember your name. You slept with your boots near your head and your knife under your blanket, because in the Wild West, you were never really alone, and never truly safe. The eighth day began, much like the seventh had ended, in stillness, in dust, and with the ache of your body protesting the act of waking. Your sleep had been shallow, interrupted not by fear but by discomfort. The ground was not kind, and your blanket held only a fading trace of warmth from the fire that had died out sometime in the night. You opened your eyes slowly, blinking into a sky that had already begun to lighten with the first gray of dawn. This far into your time in the West, routines had become instinct. You didn't need to think about what came next. You simply moved. You packed your blanket, rewrapped your sore feet, checked your meager supplies, and crouched over the fire pit. There were no conversations, no idle talk, just action. Sparks caught, and smoke rose, and eventually the flame grew strong enough to heat a pot of water. You still had any to boil. Your stomach growled, but you ignored it. Hunger had become a low hum in the background, rarely gone, never satisfied. You chewed slowly on the last scrap of salted meat, dry and fibrous. No one ate for pleasure in the Wild West. They ate because their bodies needed fuel to keep going. Every bite was calculated: what to save, what to trade, what to risk. You had no certainty of a next meal. That fact lived quietly in the corners of your thoughts. The morning air was cooler than it had been, with a brittle edge to the breeze. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped against a tree. The rhythmic sound seemed impossibly regular in a land where so little followed pattern or comfort. You started walking before the sun rose high. Travel was best done in the early hours, when the heat hadn't yet turned the road into a trial of endurance. You passed through open land, a place that might once have been grassland, though now it was mostly dust and brush. There were no fences, no markers, no signs of ownership, and yet you knew better than to assume it was free to cross. Everything belonged to someone, if not in law, then in claim, and claims were defended with bullets. You stepped carefully, eyes scanning the distance, watching for movement, watching for smoke, for signs of other people. By midday, you spotted a lone rider on the horizon. A small shape at first, barely moving, then the glint of light on metal, then the outline of a wide-brimmed hat. You didn't wave, neither did they. The rider moved slowly past, giving a wide berth, offering no greeting and no hostility, just presence. That was the unspoken language of the West: space, distance, and understanding that not every meeting needed words. At a low ridge, you came upon what had once been a camp. Tattered canvas still hung from makeshift poles, a fire pit full of blackened stones, an empty can of beans, scraps of cloth tied around a branch. The people were long gone. Maybe they moved on. Maybe something drove them out. Maybe something worse. You picked through the remains but found nothing useful. You didn't stay long. By afternoon, the sun bore down again. You found yourself pausing more often, hands on knees, sweat dripping from your brow. Your mouth was dry. You'd been conserving water, but it was almost gone. You knew the signs of dehydration: the headache, the dry eyes, the heavy limbs. The land offered no help. The ground cracked underfoot. Lizards skittered from rock to shadow. Even they looked tired. You came upon a tree, a single gnarled cottonwood, standing alone and sat beneath it. The shade it offered was thin, but you were grateful. You removed your boots to massage your blistered feet. The smell was harsh, but not surprising. The human body, under such strain, could only do so much. You thought of soft beds, of cloth sheets, of meals that weren't eaten from cans. But such thoughts faded quickly. They belonged to a different world. The late afternoon brought clouds. Not many, but enough to change the light. Shadows lengthened. Birds returned to the sky, moving in slow spirals. You walked again, slower now. Your shoulders slumped, your steps shorter. Everything ached, not just your legs, but your back, your neck, your fingers, even your jaw, tight from silence. You hadn't spoken in days, and you weren't sure what your voice would sound like anymore. That night you made camp near a group of rocks. Not shelter, but a partial wall against wind. You gathered sticks, brush, and dung for the fire. The smoke curled upward, gray against the darkening sky. The stars came out in layers, each more delicate than the last. You warmed your hands near the fire and stared into it, not thinking, not planning, just watching. The heat felt real. The only real thing. You ate what you had left, a crust of bread, a handful of dried fruit. You stretched your legs slowly, felt your knees pop. You didn't try to sleep right away. The night didn't feel threatening, but it didn't feel safe either. You sat for hours, listening first to the crackle of flame, then to the wind, then to the near silence. Sleep eventually came, like it always did, slowly, then all at once. On the 8th day, you did not question your reasons for continuing. You didn't ask why you had come here, or where you were going. You simply endured. Because in the Wild West, endurance was not heroic, was the only choice. You either lasted one more day, or you didn't. The 9th day brought with it a change in the wind. It wasn't dramatic, just enough to carry with it the faint scent of something unfamiliar. You noticed it the moment you stirred, waking in your usual position, curled around your blanket, with your boots tucked near your chest. The fire had gone cold again, though a ring of white ash told you it had burned long through the night. You sat up slowly, rubbing your shoulders, now stiff from days of walking and sleeping on uneven ground. The scent, subtle but sharp, was not of smoke or sagebrush or cattle. It was cleaner somehow, almost metallic, perhaps a sign of a settlement nearby, or perhaps not. You had learned by now that many things in the West could fool your senses. A smell might drift from miles away. A sound could echo from a place you'd never reach. You started your morning like all the others. Pack your things, scan the horizon, rebuild the fire just enough to heat water if you still had any. This morning, you had only a mouthful left. You drank half and saved the rest. It would have to last until you found something more, though you didn't know when or where that would be. The thirst had become part of you, no longer urgent, just ever present, like a shadow at your side. As you moved again, your legs felt heavier. The blisters on your feet had hardened into rough patches, painful but manageable. Your back ached with every step, and your lips were swollen from sun and dryness. But none of this felt unusual anymore. The Wild West did not accommodate comfort. If anything, it taught you to forget it existed. You did not speak aloud, not even to yourself. Words felt like a luxury, too distant to reach for. The land opened up into a dry plain. Grasses, yellow and brittle, swayed in the occasional breeze. Insects buzzed lazily. You passed a pile of bones too large to be human. A cow, perhaps, long dead. Buzzards circled above, though they were few and far between today. Most life, it seemed, had withdrawn in the heat. Even the wind felt tired. Around midday, you crested a small ridge and saw signs of people. Faint smoke, lines in the distance, maybe a ranch, maybe a camp. You weighed your options. Approaching strangers could mean help or trouble. You didn't know what kind of people lived there, or how they felt about visitors. In the West, every encounter came with risk. You had heard stories: settlers who shot first, bandits who posed as farmers, lonely men who didn't welcome company. Still, you were low on water and tired, so you went. The path wound slowly toward the smoke. You passed a fence barely standing, patched together with rope and scrap wood. A single steer looked at you from behind it, ribs visible under loose skin. Past that, a corral with no horses, just tracks in the dirt. Then, you saw the cabin. Low, made of dark logs, with a slanted roof and a single window shuttered from the inside. A woman sat on the porch. She didn't wave, she didn't rise, just watched you approach. You stopped a safe distance away, raised your hand in greeting, waited. She said nothing, then, finally, nodded once. You asked for water. Your voice was hoarse, weaker than you remembered. She nodded again, disappeared inside, returned with a metal cup and a bucket drawn from a well. You drank slowly, carefully, then thanked her. She said nothing. You offered a few coins. She didn't take them, just nodded a third time and turned her eyes back to the land. You left without asking more. She hadn't invited questions, and you had none left. As you walked away, you realized she hadn't smiled. You wondered how long she'd lived out here, how many days she'd spent just like this, watching the road, offering water, saying nothing. The West had taken her voice too, perhaps, or maybe she'd simply given it up. The rest of the afternoon passed under clouds. A rare relief. The sun, though still high, hid behind shifting gray. A breeze picked up. You smelled rain, though you saw none. The land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something that might not arrive. You moved faster, unsure why, drawn by the promise of change or shelter. You found neither, just a ravine with dry stones and a few twisted trees. You made camp again, this time with a better fire, fed by dead wood gathered earlier. You cooked what was left of your beans, ate slowly, wrapped yourself tighter in your blanket. As the temperature dropped, the wind made the fire flicker and hiss. As darkness settled in, you listened again, not for danger, but for rhythm. The sounds of the West were always there, though rarely loud. The soft howl of a coyote, the shifting branches of brush, the distant crack of something falling, maybe a tree, maybe something else you didn't check. You were too tired. The stars came out late, one by one, as if unsure whether to shine. You lay back on the earth, which was warmer than expected, and let the Sky fill your view. There was no moon tonight, just the sweep of stars and the endless dark between them. You wondered how many travelers before you had looked up at this same sky, how many had made it farther, how many had not. The ninth night in the Wild West was quiet, not peaceful, just quiet. It didn't promise anything, it didn't reassure you, but it didn't take from you either. And that, out here, was something close to mercy. The 10th day began with a strange sense of weightlessness, as if your body had finally stopped resisting the rhythm of the West and had simply yielded. You woke up slowly, not sharply, your thoughts dulled by a night of thin sleep and restless dreams. The fire had gone out again and the ash was cold. The sky above you was overcast, but the air was dry. There would be no rain, just clouds drifting overhead like worn fabric, frayed at the edges and slow in their motion. You moved as you always did, now quietly, methodically, with little thought or emotion. You wrapped your blanket, checked your gear, stretched your legs, and tested the weight on your feet. The ache was still there, but it had become familiar. Pain had lost its edge. It lived with you now like an old companion. You drank the last of your water, which had turned warm and metallic in its container, and ate a handful of hard bread. It cracked in your mouth like stone. You chewed slowly, patiently, without tasting it. The journey this day took you into terrain that rolled gently at first, then steepened into low hills. The soil was red and dry, and your boots kicked up fine dust with every step. Scrub bushes lined the trail, brittle and sharp-edged. Occasionally, you spotted birds resting on rocks. Mostly, they watched you pass with flat, unreadable eyes. Life was always watching in the Wild West. It just didn't always care what it saw. By late morning, you reached a point where the land dropped suddenly. A deep valley lay below, carved by centuries of wind and the memory of water. In the distance, far, at the valley's edge, you saw the glint of movement too far to make out. Maybe a wagon, maybe a man on horseback, maybe nothing. The distances in the West lied often. What seemed near was sometimes a full day away. You didn't change your direction, you just noted it. Kept walking. At midday, you paused beneath a rocky overhang that offered a sliver of shade. The sun had broken through the clouds by then, casting long shadows and heating the earth until it seemed to breathe with warmth. You leaned against the stone, not because you were tired, though you were, but because stopping was what your body chose for you. You didn't question it. You hadn't had the energy for questions in days. You thought briefly of the people you had once known, those who had never left towns or cities, who had never walked a mile without a road beneath their feet. You wondered if they would believe what this felt like. The constant grit between your teeth, the way your skin had taken on the smell of earth and smoke, the way silence had become louder than speech. In the Wild West, the world didn't tell you what you were doing. It just watched as you did it. You resumed walking in the afternoon. The path now led along the edge of a dry wash, its banks steep and crumbling. A wrong step could lead to a fall, so you kept close to the inside wall, each step careful, deliberate. You passed a collapsed wagon, just the frame left, its wheels long gone. Shattered glass glittered among the dirt, and nearby, the skeleton of a mule, mostly intact. You didn't stop. There was nothing left to see, just the remains of someone else's journey, finished before yours. Later, as shadows lengthened, you found a place to stop for the night. A slight depression in the land, surrounded by a few stubborn trees and a scattering of rocks. You gathered enough wood to build a small fire, and started it with your last bit of dry kindling. The flame caught, flickered low, and steadied. You sat cross-legged and let the heat touch your face. There was no wind, no sound. The West for now was still. You boiled the last of your coffee, thin and bitter, but hot. You drank it slowly, staring into the flame, your mind too worn to wander. Around you, the land grew dark. Coyotes called in the distance, but they sounded far away. You didn't feel fear, not because the danger wasn't real, but because fear had dulled like everything else. The West had stripped it from you, peeled it back, left only awareness and instinct. You slept lightly now, because you had to, not because you wanted to. As the stars emerged, bright and cold, you wrapped yourself in your blanket and lay down near the fire. You placed your boots beneath your knees and your knife beside your hand. Not for comfort, there was no such thing anymore, but for necessity. The night was long. Your dreams were strange. Images of cities, of warmth, of hands you once knew. But they didn't stay. They never did. On the 10th night, you understood more clearly than ever that this was not adventure. It was not romance or legend. It was endurance, repetition, and the slow erosion of self against a land that neither welcomed nor resisted you. It simply existed. And if you could exist alongside it for one more day, that was enough. The 12th day began without event, as most days did in the West. There was no sudden alarm, no change in weather, no danger pressing in from the darkness. You awoke slowly, your limbs stiff from lying on uneven ground, your back aching where the roots of a shallow tree had pressed against you during the night. The fire you hadn't built had left no coals, and the warmth of the previous day had long since drained away into the chilled hours of early morning. The sky above was pale, the light barely reaching through a low haze of cloud. You stretched your arms in silence, already feeling the weight of the hours ahead. There was no breakfast this morning. You had long since stopped thinking of meals as distinct things. Instead, food had become a memory, something to be chased when it appeared, ignored when it didn't. You sucked on a pebble to stir up the feeling of moisture in your mouth. It was something travelers did, you'd heard, though whether it actually helped or just gave the illusion of relief was impossible to tell. You took one careful sip of water and began to walk. The land was flatter, here wide, dusty, open. The horizon offered little shelter. A few distant trees, barely more than shrubs, stood scattered like brittle skeletons. Insects buzzed occasionally, and your boots crunched on dry dirt with each step. There were no birds. There hadn't been for 2 days. That worried you slightly. Birds meant water. Their absence meant something else. Still, you pressed on. By mid-morning you found a trail, not one worn smooth like a road, but a set of overlapping paths made by hooves and boots and perhaps the turning wheels of carts. It was unclear where the trail went, or whether it had been used recently, but it offered a direction, and direction meant purpose, even if it was borrowed. The sun crept higher, though it never fully emerged from behind the haze. Heat radiated from the ground more than from the sky. Your hat, now sweat-stained and warped from wear, offered little protection. You pulled your scarf across your nose, not for warmth, but to keep the dust from rising into your lungs. It barely helped. Every breath felt thick. You paused beside a dry fence once used, perhaps, to mark the edge of someone's cattle range. The wood was gray and crumbling, tied together with old iron wire, some of which had snapped and curled like rusted vines. You leaned on a post and looked out across the land. There was no movement, no sound beyond the faint hum of wind across the plain. It felt as though the world had gone quiet to test your patience. You continued walking, your mind wandering as your feet carried you forward. Thoughts came slowly now, and without urgency. You remembered stories from back east, romantic tales of the frontier, of men carving homes from the wilderness, of wide skies and brave deeds. But those stories, you knew, had left out the long days. They'd skipped the wind that chafed your skin raw, the thirst that gnawed at your tongue, the way silence could stretch so far that your own heartbeat felt loud. In those stories, the West was an idea. Out here, it was just work. Sometime in the afternoon, you spotted movement, a lone figure on horseback, far to the south, crossing the plain at a slow trot. You froze. It was instinctual. In the Wild West, the appearance of a stranger could mean anything a Dane. Nothing at all. You dropped low and waited behind a patch of low grass. The rider didn't look your way. He or she rode on, following a path you couldn't see. You stayed hidden until they were gone, the figure shrinking into the heat-hazed distance like a mirage. Only when the sky was empty again did you rise and continue. That night you made camp behind a cluster of boulders. There was no wood for fire, so you didn't build one. Instead, you pulled your blanket close and tried not to move. The stars above were faint through the haze, but they were there, constant, distant, and cold. You stared at them for a long while, your thoughts dull but steady. No part of you longed for comfort anymore. You didn't wish for home. The West had taken that too. What you wanted, perhaps, was one more uneventful day. One more chance to keep moving forward without being stopped. Sleep came without dreams. Just the press of your body into the dirt, the weight of the blanket on your chest, the sound of your breath in the open dark. On the 12th night, you realized that the Wild West didn't test you with sudden violence or grand trials. Its strength came from repetition. It wore you down slowly, not with hardship, but with the absence of relief. And that, more than anything, was what most could not endure. The 13th morning arrived without much color. The sky above was a uniform gray, the air cool but dry, and the wind barely present. It was not dramatic, not stormy, not especially threatening. It simply was. You sat up slowly, your limbs stiff as ever, your back aching from the flat, unforgiving ground. The stiffness wasn't as sharp as it had once been. Your body had begun to accept it, to adapt. Though nothing truly grew easier out here, just more familiar. There was still no fire, there was no wood to burn, and little reason to waste energy gathering fuel for a spark that wouldn't warm you for long. You chewed on a piece of leather cord just to keep your jaw moving. It wasn't food, but it occupied your mouth and reminded your stomach that it was still empty. There was no breakfast. Again, but you no longer thought of meals in terms of absence. They were rare visitors now. If they came, they came. If not, you walked. The trail today was marked by dry tracks and bones. Not many, just scattered reminders of animals that had once wandered too far, or stayed too long without water. A partial skull here, a rib cage there. Even the insects had left long ago. There were no birds circling above, no animal calls in the distance. The silence was complete. The only sound was the faint crunch of your own boots against the brittle earth. Mid-morning passed without change. You stopped briefly beneath a crooked dead tree, its branches bare and bleached by years of sun. It offered no shade but gave your eyes something to rest on. You drank from your canteen 2 careful sips, then stopped. You were not out yet, but close. Water had become the one constant measure of your future. As long as there was water, you could go another day. When it ran dry, so would everything else. You pressed onward, heading west, because it felt like the right direction, even though no sign told you so. The sun broke through the clouds in patches, sending beams of pale light onto the dry ground. It looked beautiful, but only from a distance. Up close, the land remained the same, hostile in its indifference, unchanging in its silence. There was nothing personal about it. It didn't hate you. It simply didn't care if you were there, around. Noon, you came across the ruins of a small settlement. Just a few wooden structures, leaning against time. An old corral, its fence mostly fallen, surrounded nothing. A shack stood with its door half off the hinges, creaking slightly in the breeze. You approached slowly, not from fear, but caution. You had learned that abandoned places in the West often held less than they promised, and sometimes more than you wanted to find. Inside the shack was dust and the faint smell of rot. A cot in the corner, a metal bucket, the remnants of a stove rusted through. Someone had lived here. You could tell by the markings on the wall, tallies scratched into wood, likely counting days or something like them. You added one more scratch without thinking, then stepped back into the light. You didn't stay long. Places like that held memories that were not your own, and burdens you hadn't earned. You moved on. Later that afternoon, you spotted the dark shimmer of water. Not a lake, or even a pond, just a shallow dip in the land where rain had once pooled. It was little more than a muddy patch now, but enough for a few swallows of moisture, and the effort of filtering what you could into your canteen. Tasted of iron and dirt, but it was wet, and that was all that mattered. You decided to camp early. The energy in your legs was fading faster these days. You found a low ridge and made your bed on its leeward side, where the wind couldn't reach you as directly. You didn't make a fire. The ground was bare, and you wanted to keep your presence unnoticed. The longer you spent in the West, the more you understood that being seen was never an advantage. That night, the stars were clearer than before. The haze had lifted. You lay on your back, staring upward, watching the sky shift slowly, patiently, without urgency. You thought of the people who had once crossed this land in wagons, with families, with hopes, with tools and maps and plans. Most of them hadn't made it far. Most had been broken by the same things that pressed on you now: hunger, thirst, isolation, silence. The difference between them and you was only time. You fell asleep with your hands folded on your chest, and your knife tucked close. You didn't dream. Dreams required the luxury of peace. Out here, the only thing the night brought was rest in the absence of disruption. On the 13th day, the Wild West offered you no lesson, no insight, no turning point. Just another stretch of land that needed crossing, another patch of ground on which to sleep, and another reminder that out here, simply continuing was the greatest achievement of all. The 14th morning did not greet you with warmth or urgency. Instead, it arrived quietly, carried in by a thin, dry breeze that moved the dust in small swirls around the edge of your bedroll. You opened your eyes slowly, blinked against the faint light of dawn, and remained still for several minutes, listening. There were no sounds beyond the shifting of the wind and the distant groan of something wooden, perhaps a fence post giving way in the distance, or simply your imagination trying to find shape in silence. Your body protested when you sat up, your shoulders stiff and your legs slow to respond. Days of walking, of sleeping on uneven ground, of carrying more than you should, all of it left you moving like an older version of yourself. You stretched your neck and arms, shook out your legs, then stood carefully, feeling the tug of sore muscles. There was no rush. The land would still be there, waiting, whether you moved now or an hour later. You took one sip of water, small, deliberate hand, packed your things. The blanket, now more dust than fabric, folded tightly against your gear. You didn't bother brushing yourself clean. There was no one to see you. Out here, there were no mirrors, no expectations of appearance, and no reward for neatness. Dirt was simply the condition of being alive. The trail today was less visible than before. The land had flattened into a wide, broken plain with no markers to guide your steps. Occasionally, a piece of debris appeared, a rusted horseshoe, shard of pottery, the rim of a metal pail half buried in the earth. They were relics left behind by others who had passed through and moved on, or who had stayed too long. You walked slowly, pausing to look at these remnants, not out of curiosity, but because there was nothing else to do. By mid-morning you came upon a telegraph, pole still upright though, leaning heavily. A single strand of wire remained, stretched, taut between two distant poles. The wire hummed slightly, moved by the breeze. It reminded you that the world beyond the west still existed. Somewhere, people were writing letters, sending telegrams, arguing in shops, sitting down to hot meals. It felt distant. It felt unimportant. You walked on. A little after noon, you spotted movement on the horizon. Not people, animals, 3 horses, wild or abandoned, grazing near a dry stream. Their coats were thin and dusty, their ribs slightly visible beneath their hides. They did not flee as you approached, just lifted their heads and watched you pass. You didn't try to get close. A wild horse could kill a man faster than a loaded gun if it felt cornered. And besides, even if you caught one, you had no saddle, no rope, no feed. They were better left alone. You sat near the stream for a while, resting in the partial shade of a bent mesquite tree. The water was long gone, just sand and cracked mud where it had once flowed, but the shape of it comforted you. It reminded you that water had been here once, and might be again. You chewed on a dry stem of grass, just to feel something in your mouth, and leaned your back against the tree. In the distance, you could see the faint outlines of hills, not mountains, but a change in the land, a rise that might offer cooler air or a new direction. You decided to aim for them, even though they were many hours away. Walking gave you something to do. It was better than thinking, better than waiting. The afternoon heat was sharp, and though the sun remained partly hidden, the dry air sucked the moisture from your skin. You stopped often, not because you wanted to, but because your legs demanded it. A person who had never walked this far under this kind of sky wouldn't understand how exhausting the act of simply moving could become. Each step required attention. Each breath dried your throat further. The world pressed down, not with cruelty, but with complete disregard. Near dusk, you found another abandoned structure, smaller than the last. Perhaps it had once been a storage shed or an outpost. There was no door, no roof, just 3 walls, standing and a pile of collapsed timber beside it. You made camp in its shadow. It wasn't shelter in the traditional sense, but it offered a place to sit, to rest your back against something solid, and to feel a trace of human presence. Long since gone, you didn't light a fire. You didn't cook. There was nothing to burn and nothing to heat. You sipped what remained of your water and lay down on your blanket, folding your hat over your face to block the last glow of the fading sky. You heard no animals, no owls, no coyotes, just the hum of wind through the broken slats of the ruin. On the 14th night, you didn't think of home. You didn't imagine rescue. You simply allowed the quiet to settle around you like dust. The West had not beaten you yet, but it had succeeded in making you forget what comfort was, what stillness used to feel like, what warmth once meant. You weren't surviving out of strength anymore, but out of habit, and even that, you knew, could wear away. The 15th morning broke with a faint rustle of dry air sliding over dead grass. You stirred slowly, your body reluctant to rise, your limbs heavy from a restless night spent without fire or warmth. The ache in your back had become normal, the stiffness in your knees expected. As you sat up and rubbed the sleep from your eyes, the sun had already begun its slow climb, casting pale light across the endless, familiar emptiness of the land. You didn't speak. There was no one to speak to. Words felt like a luxury. You'd forgotten how to use a skill that dulled from disuse. The only sound was the crunch of your boots as you rose to your feet, rolled up your blanket, and secured the meager supplies you carried. There was no breakfast again, not even the hint of a meal. Your hunger was like a quiet companion, now never gone, never sharp, just always there. The terrain had changed only slightly, some rise and fall in the earth, more patches of cracked rock and sand, fewer plants than even before. The trail you had been following for days had dissolved entirely, leaving only the compass in your mind and the line of hills ahead to guide your steps. You aimed for them, more out of ritual than hope, trusting that movement itself might lead you toward something better, even if you didn't believe it would. As you walked, the sun rose higher. The air warmed quickly, not with the comfort of spring, but with the dry, biting edge of desert heat. The breeze disappeared by mid-morning, replaced by a stillness that made the world feel like it had stopped turning. Sweat gathered on your forehead, then evaporated before it could drip. You licked your lips constantly, though they remained dry and cracked. You stopped beside a rock outcrop, its shade small but welcome. There you sat for a time, staring at the dust on your boots. You remembered stories people had told about pioneers, men and women who crossed the country with wagons and dreams. You remembered how those stories had sounded noble and brave, but no one had mentioned the hours spent staring at your feet, the endless silence, the pain that started in your heels and slowly crept up through your legs, settling in your spine. Like something permanent, by early afternoon, you began to ascend the low hills. The climb was not steep, but it was long and broken by loose stone and dry gullies. You moved carefully. A twisted ankle here meant real trouble, no one to help. No horse to carry you, no nearby town with a doctor. You placed each step like a carpenter setting nails, deliberate and slow. At the crest of the ridge, you paused and looked out. The land stretched far, flat, dry, harsh. In the distance, a glint of something caught your eye. It could have been a roof, a stream, a trick of light on rock. You stared at it a long time, unsure if it was real. But even if it wasn't, it gave you a reason to keep going. That was enough. You descended the ridge carefully. The sun now hung low, golden but still intense. You had a little water left, just enough for a mouthful, and you drank it without ceremony. The dust on your tongue returned instantly. You didn't mind. That too had become a normal part of your days. Near dusk, you found a dry wash where the earth dipped slightly and the wind could not reach you. You gathered a few thorny branches, not enough to burn, but enough to arrange in a loose ring around your blanket. A trick you'd learned from stories. It wouldn't stop a predator, but it might slow one. You knew the chances of something wandering into your camp were low, but you didn't want to be surprised. You lay down with your arms crossed over your chest and your eyes open, watching the dark deepen. The stars would come soon. They always did. Their presence didn't comfort you. but they reminded you that some things in the world continued unchanged, even as you did not. On the 15th night you understood that this was how the West truly tested people, not with gunfights or stampedes or saloons full of outlaws, but with the steady, grinding erosion of the self. It took away the conveniences of life first, then the comforts, then the memories of comfort. Eventually it left only movement, and even that became a kind of forgetting. You blinked slowly, your body sore but still, the weight of your exhaustion pressing you into the earth. There were no plans for tomorrow, no destination, just the certainty of waking and walking and hoping the land might let you continue for one more day. The 16th morning began, not with light, but with sound. A low creaking noise stirred you before the sky had begun to change. You lay still, unsure if it had come from your own body shifting in sleep, or from something just beyond the edge of your resting place. But as the silence returned, long and complete, you accepted it was nothing to worry about. Out here, the mind often filled the stillness with imagined danger. You turned onto your side and let your breath settle, waiting for the first signs of dawn to find your camp. When the light came, it did so with little ceremony. A pale yellow glow eased across the dust and rock, touching the branches of the scrubby bushes with a soft hue. There were no colors in the sky, no birds overhead, no smell of dew. The earth was dry as ever, the air cool but brittle. You sat up slowly, joints clicking into motion, and brushed the fine grit from your clothes. There was no reason to rush. The land would still be waiting. You rose and took inventory. Your canteen was nearly empty, now just a few spoonfuls of tepid water sloshed at the bottom. You swallowed one small mouthful and carefully recorked the rest. A single swallow left an idea you repeated to yourself more than once, as if naming it could make it last longer. You tied your belongings into your bundle and moved on, boots scuffing the ground softly. The world looked the same in all directions. No trail, no prints, no sign that any living thing had passed through here in weeks, maybe months. But you chose west, because west was where the maps had once pointed. You weren't certain whether those maps still applied, but direction was a comfort in itself. Even when meaningless, it gave you something to walk toward. By mid-morning you came across an old fence. Not a complete one, just a post here, another farther off, some with rusted wires still clinging to their sides. You followed the line of them for a while, thinking perhaps they would lead somewhere, but they vanished eventually into a stretch of open rock. The fence had once meant boundaries, land that had been claimed, perhaps worked, but no one was working it now. The land had reclaimed itself, as it always did. The sun grew sharper with each hour, and the air thinned with the heat. You felt your lips crack further, and the sweat beneath your hat dried before it could cool you. You walked slower now. Every step had to be measured. You looked for shade, but there was none. Occasionally, a vulture would glide overhead. You didn't look up. You'd learned not to read meaning into the movement of birds. In the early afternoon, you found something unusual, a wagon wheel, mostly intact, half buried in the dust. It had no wagon with it, no broken spokes scattered nearby, no bones, just the wheel, resting alone in the dirt. You crouched beside it, not with interest but because bending your knees gave you a reason to rest. You ran a hand along the worn wood, splinters catching your skin. It hadn't rolled in years. You moved on without deciding to. Your feet simply began again, pulled forward by the habit of going. The landscape ahead held low rocks and brush, but no water, no shelter. You stopped only once more before dusk, crouching behind a small rise where the wind was less sharp. There you rested your legs, chewed a piece of leather, and stared at nothing. Thought the evening came quietly. No wind, no change in temperature, just a slow fading of the sky's color from pale gold to dusty gray. You found a shallow dip in the land enough to block the breeze and settled there. You didn't unroll your blanket. The ground was soft with sand, and you were too tired to prepare anything. You took the last swallow of water, held it in your mouth for a moment, then let it slide down your throat. There was nothing left to save. You watched the stars appear, one by one. They came with their usual stillness, not flickering but simply arriving, as they had each night before. You did not name them. You had forgotten which ones were which. You closed your eyes and listened to the silence. On the 16th night, the West did not try to kill you. It did not send rattlesnakes or storms or bandits. It simply wore on, indifferent and constant, testing your ability to go without food, without warmth, without hope even. And still, somehow, you remained. There was no triumph in your survival. Just another night passed under a sky that did not care whether you lived or died. You drifted into sleep not because it was comfortable, but because you were too tired to stay awake. There were no dreams, just the slow forgetting of where you were and why. The 16th morning began, not with light, but with sound. A low creaking noise stirred you before the sky had begun to change. You lay still, unsure if it had come from your own body shifting in sleep, or from something just beyond the edge of your resting place. But as the silence returned, long and complete, you accepted it was nothing to worry about. Out here, the mind often filled the stillness with imagined danger. You turned onto your side and let your breath settle, waiting for the first signs of dawn to find your camp. When the light came, it did so with little ceremony. A pale yellow glow eased across the dust and rock, touching the branches of the scrubby bushes with a soft hue. There were no colors in the sky, no birds overhead, no smell of dew. The earth was dry as ever, the air cool but brittle. You sat up slowly, joints clicking into motion, and brushed the fine grit from your clothes. There was no reason to rush. The land would still be waiting. You rose and took inventory. Your canteen was nearly empty, now just a few spoonfuls of tepid water sloshed at the bottom. You swallowed one small mouthful and carefully recorked the rest. A single swallow left an idea you repeated to yourself more than once, as if naming it could make it last longer. You tied your belongings into your bundle and moved on, boots scuffing the ground softly. The world looked the same in all directions. No trail, no prints, no sign that any living thing had passed through here in weeks, maybe months. But you chose west, because west was where the maps had once pointed. You weren't certain whether those maps still applied, but direction was a comfort in itself. Even when meaningless, it gave you something to walk toward. By mid-morning you came across an old fence. Not a complete one, just a post here, another farther off, some with rusted wires still clinging to their sides. You followed the line of them for a while, thinking perhaps they would lead somewhere, but they vanished eventually into a stretch of open rock. The fence had once meant boundaries, land that had been claimed, perhaps worked, but no one was working it now. The land had reclaimed itself, as it always did. The sun grew sharper with each hour, and the air thinned with the heat. You felt your lips crack further, and the sweat beneath your hat dried before it could cool you. You walked slower now. Every step had to be measured. You looked for shade, but there was none. Occasionally, a vulture would glide overhead. You didn't look up. You'd learned not to read meaning into the movement of birds. In the early afternoon, you found something unusual, a wagon wheel, mostly intact, half buried in the dust. It had no wagon with it, no broken spokes scattered nearby, no bones, just the wheel, resting alone in the dirt. You crouched beside it, not with interest but because bending your knees gave you a reason to rest. You ran a hand along the worn wood, splinters catching your skin. It hadn't rolled in years. You moved on without deciding to. Your feet simply began again, pulled forward by the habit of going. The landscape ahead held low rocks and brush, but no water, no shelter. You stopped only once more before dusk, crouching behind a small rise where the wind was less sharp. There you rested your legs, chewed a piece of leather, and stared at nothing. Thought the evening came quietly. No wind, no change in temperature, just a slow fading of the sky's color from pale gold to dusty gray. You found a shallow dip in the land enough to block the breeze and settled there. You didn't unroll your blanket. The ground was soft with sand, and you were too tired to prepare anything. You took the last swallow of water, held it in your mouth for a moment, then let it slide down your throat. There was nothing left to save. You watched the stars appear, one by one. They came with their usual stillness, not flickering but simply arriving, as they had each night before. You did not name them. You had forgotten which ones were which. You closed your eyes and listened to the silence. On the 16th night, the West did not try to kill you. It did not send rattlesnakes or storms or bandits. It simply wore on, indifferent and constant, testing your ability to go without food, without warmth, without hope even. And still, somehow, you remained. There was no triumph in your survival. Just another night passed under a sky that did not care whether you lived or died. You drifted into sleep not because it was comfortable, but because you were too tired to stay awake. There were no dreams, just the slow forgetting of where you were and why. On the 17th morning, there was no sunrise to greet you, only a gradual lifting of the darkness into something slightly less dark. The sky had filled with a dull film of cloud sometime in the night, casting the world in a lifeless gray. It was the kind of sky that offered no rain, no shadow, no warmth, just a strange, metallic stillness that dulled every sound and made the land feel even more remote. You sat up slowly, your body moving out of habit, your thoughts still foggy from a shallow sleep. Your tongue was dry, your mouth bitter. You reached for your canteen even though you knew it was empty. You shook it, listened for any slosh of hope, then let it fall against the dirt. There would be no water unless you found it. And out here, water was not something you stumbled upon. It had to be earned or surrendered to. There was a ridge ahead, low and gentle, but taller than the one you had crossed before, you figured. It was as good a direction as any. Hills sometimes meant shade, sometimes meant wind, sometimes meant a hollowed tree or a stone depression that once held rain. You didn't count on it. You didn't expect anything. But you started walking toward it anyway. The land stretched wide and empty on all sides, broken only by the occasional dry shrub or patch of lichen clinging to rock. Even the birds were gone. There were no hawks today, no vultures. The sky was blank and low. You stopped once to rub your eyes, though they weren't tired. They were simply raw. Dust and wind had taken their toll days ago. You could still see, but your vision seemed more like something you wore than something you trusted. You climbed the ridge by mid-morning, your feet dragging slightly. The incline was not steep, but the ground gave way in places. Loose stones, dry earth, and slanted shale that forced you to plant your boots carefully. When you reached the top, you paused and stood still, looking out over the land below. What you saw wasn't comforting, just more of the same scrubland, empty horizon. Maybe far off a clump of trees, or maybe just a trick of distance. You blinked slowly. It didn't matter. You would keep going either way. As you descended, you saw something in the dirt tracks. Not fresh, but not ancient. Hoofprints, shallow and scattered. Maybe 3 animals, maybe more. It could have been a small herd of wild horses, or someone passing through with a wagon team. You crouched beside them, touched the sun-hardened impressions. They pointed northwest, veering slightly toward the cluster of trees you had noticed earlier. That was enough to nudge your path. You followed. The hours passed slowly. The heat, though muted by the clouds, still pressed into your skin, not burning, but constant. Like wearing a coat made of air, too thick to escape. You stopped often now, not from pain, but from something quieter, fatigue that lived in the bones. You would rest for minutes, then rise again, only to walk 20 steps and stop once more. The rhythm became a kind of surrender, a ritual. You reached the trees late in the day. They were smaller than you hoped. A few mesquite, 2 or 3 juniper, and what might once have been a cottonwood, now hollow and dead. But beneath the largest tree, you found what you did not expect, a shallow depression in the dirt, lined with smooth stones. A basin. It had dried out long ago, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Once, water had gathered here. You knelt beside it, placed your hand on the ground. It was dry, of course, but cooler than the surrounding earth. You stayed there as the sun began to lower, though it never truly appeared. The light dimmed without ceremony. You leaned against the trunk of the old tree and closed your eyes. No shelter, but it was a place to sit without staring at the horizon. That felt like a gift. When darkness came, you did not move. You ate nothing, drank nothing. You only breathed, listening to the faint rustle of the trees, the creak of old branches shifting in the breeze. You weren't afraid. Not of wolves, not of bandits, not of ghosts or fever or the stars themselves. The only fear now was silence, too deep to escape, a quiet so wide that even your own thoughts felt like strangers passing through. On the 17th night, you realized something that didn't surprise you. The West didn't kill you in a moment. It didn't strike from behind or drop you with a bullet. It just asked you to keep going, and going, and going, until the going itself became too much. You drifted into sleep, not as a choice, but as a slipping away, a slow fall into nothing. You hoped for dreams, but found none, just darkness, and that, somehow, felt like peace. The 18th morning came without ceremony, just a slow shift in the light that turned the edge of the horizon from dark gray to a shade closer to ash. The sky still hung low with dull clouds, not the kind that brought rain, just the kind that pressed downward as if trying to settle on the ground itself. You opened your eyes and remained still, not because you wanted more sleep, but because movement had begun to feel like a choice you needed to think through carefully. You sat up with effort, your back stiff, your legs slow to respond. The tree you had leaned against in the night stood silent behind you, its bark rough against your shoulder. You looked again at the dry basin near your feet, still empty, still dusty. Nothing had changed, and somehow that was easier to accept than hope. Hope asked too much. You checked your supplies again, though there was nothing to find. The canteen was dry. You hadn't eaten in more than a day. You knew your body was slowing, not just in pace, but in something deeper, something harder too. Measure your thoughts came in slower waves. Your fingers shook slightly when you tied the blanket roll. Even blinking took more effort than it should have. Still, you stood and walked. The world stretched flat again, as if the hills and trees had been part of someone else's dream. You chose a direction because it was there. The same westward lean, a little to the north maybe. You didn't really know anymore. You had no compass, no stars, no markers. Just your own sense of forward, which had become less about distance and more about motion. So long as you moved, you were still something. The wind picked up later in the morning, not strong, but steady. It brought with it a fine mist of dust that settled into your clothes, your hair, your mouth. You breathed through your sleeve when you could. The landscape blurred slightly, not from the weather, but from your eyes, which watered constantly now, as if resisting the reality of the air around them. By midday, you found a skeleton. Not human, a long-dead steer maybe, picked clean by time and creatures long gone. The ribs curled toward the sky, smooth and bleached. You stood beside it for a while, not because you were shocked, but because it was something to look at, something other than dust and brush. You ran your fingers along one rib, and for a moment you imagined what it must have been like for the animal, walking this land, hoping for water, finding only sky. You moved on again, more slowly. Your feet dragged now. The rhythm of walking had changed, not from stride to stride, but from pause to pause. You stopped more often, leaning against stones, resting on one knee, closing your eyes for seconds that became minutes. In the late afternoon, you saw a bird. A single bird, circling high above. A hawk, perhaps. Or maybe a buzzard. You stared at it for a long time, following its lazy arc across the sky. It felt strange to see something alive, something moving with purpose. You didn't wave at it, didn't try to follow. You simply watched it until it disappeared into the pale haze. You found no shade that evening, no tree, no ridge, just a dip in the land where the wind didn't bite so hard. You sat cross-legged on the ground, your hands in your lap, your head tilted down slightly, eyes half closed. You didn't unroll your blanket. You didn't lie down, you just sat. The sun dipped somewhere behind you, behind the clouds. You barely noticed that as darkness crept in. You listened for sounds and heard only your own breath. Even that seemed quieter than before. You weren't afraid of dying, not here, not now. You just didn't know if you were still living the same way. Your mind wandered to memories, faces, voices, streets, the sound of a door closing, the weight of boots on wooden floorboards. But they came to you as though from another life, like stories you'd once overheard and half remembered. On the 18th night, you didn't make a fire, you didn't eat, you didn't write or think or dream. You just sat like a stone or an old post in the ground, worn, still and unnoticed. The Wild West, it turned out, didn't require heroism or violence to break a person. It only required time and silence, and the slow, patient erosion of everything human. When your eyes finally closed, there were no stars, no howls in the distance, no wind across your face, just the weight of nothing, and the thought, as faint as breath, that maybe tomorrow would not come. Or maybe it would, and that, too, would be a kind of mercy. The 19th morning arrived without warning. There was no song of birds, no rooster crowing in a distant town, no stirring of life beyond your own shallow breath. The sun, hidden behind a thick veil of early cloud, cast only the faintest impression of light across the bare land. You opened your eyes not because something woke you, but because your body had decided rest was no longer possible. You sat up slowly, unsure if you'd truly slept, or simply existed in a dull pause through the night. The ache in your body had grown quieter, not gone, but muted in the way deep fatigue tends to silence pain rather than heal it. Your stomach, empty now for 2 days, had stopped complaining. It had learned to wait, perhaps, or perhaps it had given up. The dryness in your throat no longer itched, but sat like fine dust behind your teeth. You could swallow, but each swallow reminded you of absence. You didn't speak. You hadn't spoken aloud in days. There was no one to hear you, and even your thoughts had grown silent, more image than word. You tied your blanket again, not tightly, but carefully. Your fingers moved slower than before. Every knot took concentration. Every gesture felt like it had weight. You stood, and the ground beneath you felt less certain, like walking on something not quite real. You leaned forward, placed one foot ahead of the other, and began to move not with determination, but with obligation. The Wild West was not behind you or in front of you. It was inside now, part of the slowness in your limbs. The long pauses between breaths, the distance between footsteps. The terrain had changed slightly. Less dust, more hard stone and low shrubs. The colors remained dull, variations of brown and gray, with the occasional sickly green of a thorn bush or weed. You passed a sun-bleached sign nailed to a rotting post. The wood was too worn to read. The message, whatever it once was, had long since faded. You didn't stop by mid-morning. You spotted movement in the distance, low and uneven, something between a rock and a living thing. As you drew closer, you saw what it was: an old mule, alone, its ribs sharp beneath its hide, one eye clouded, standing with its head lowered, chewing nothing. It did not run. It didn't move at all. It looked at you the way the land did, without recognition or judgment, just a blank endurance. You paused beside it for a moment, but said nothing. You didn't reach out. There was no point. The two of you shared the same story now, wandering, half forgotten, held together by habit more than hope. You continued walking. The mule stayed. The sky cleared slightly in the early afternoon, but it brought no comfort. The sun returned with its dry warmth, heating the stones and thickening the air. You sweated despite the thirst, and each drop felt wasted, drawn out of you by a force that gave nothing back. At some point, the land dipped into a shallow canyon. The stone walls were low, only a few feet high, but they gave the sense of enclosure. You followed the natural path it carved, footsteps slow and uneven. The silence here was different, less open, more contained. You could hear the soft crunch of gravel underfoot, the occasional sigh of wind between the rocks. It was a kind of company. As evening approached, the canyon widened, the ground flattened. You came upon a stretch of cracked earth where, long ago, a river might have passed. There was no moisture now, just lines etched into the dirt like forgotten letters. You crouched and touched the ground. It crumbled easily, no dampness, no sign of life. But once, surely this place had mattered. You stayed there, not by choice, but because you could go no farther. You sat down, legs crossed, arms resting loosely at your sides. You didn't unpack anything. There was nothing left to unpack. You leaned back against a slope of earth and watched the sky shift from pale gold to gray. Once again, no one would find you here. No rider passing through, no caravan, no townsfolk wandering too far. You were a small part of a vast, indifferent wilderness. Not remarkable, not missed, just present. On the 19th night, there were no thoughts of rescue, no fire to build, no strength to pretend. Only a quiet stillness that wrapped around you like a blanket woven from dust and memory. You let your eyes drift closed, not to escape, but to pause. Not in fear, not in triumph, just the end of another day. The Wild West was not about duels or gold or glory. It was the slow undoing of a person beneath a sky too wide to understand, in a land that offered nothing and asked only everything in return. On the 20th day, the land was unchanged. The air was dry, the sun indifferent, and the wind slow and directionless. Morning came not as a bright arrival, but as a gradual easing of darkness. Nothing soughed, nothing loud, just light, soft, and gray peeling back the night like an old layer of worn cloth. You opened your eyes, slowly, no alarm, no reason to hurry. The aches in your body felt like old companions now. Not pain exactly, just reminders that you were still here, still part of the land, still unfinished. You didn't speak, you didn't groan, you didn't stretch, you simply breathed, shallow and even. The silence of the morning was deep. It was not peace, it was not loneliness. It was just the kind of silence that had always existed here, long before you, long before trails were marked, or cabins were built, or lines were drawn on maps by men who would never set foot in this soil. You stood up with effort and felt the sun warming your shoulders, not strong, just steady. You didn't reach for your blanket roll because you had not unrolled it. Didn't check your bag because you had no food. You didn't look at your canteen because you already knew, empty. You began walking again. The direction didn't matter. There were no roads here, no signs, no fences or smoke in the distance. You weren't looking for salvation or civilization. You were simply doing what the West required, moving forward until there was no forward left. The land before you was flat and cracked. Little tufts of brown grass clung to the ground like they had grown tired of trying. There were no trees, no birds, not even the bones of animals to break the sameness. Only stone, wind, and the far-off shimmer of heat that may have been water once or may never have been anything at all. You passed the ruins of a wagon, half buried in dust. The wood had split, one wheel broken, the canvas torn. It had been here for years, maybe decades. You didn't stop to investigate. You didn't wonder who had left it. You already knew. Someone like you. Someone who had believed they were ready. Someone who had dreamed of land and fortune and freedom, only to meet the truth that the Wild West was not a place of dreams. It was a place of endurance. As the hours dragged on, your thoughts slowed. Your legs continued, though not with strength, just momentum. You stopped noticing time. The sun was a white circle overhead. The sky was a faded blue with streaks of yellow. Somewhere behind you, clouds were forming, but they would not bring rain. They rarely did. You found a stone outcrop by late afternoon, low and flat, offering a patch of shade. You sat, not out of strategy, but simply because your body told you it was time to stop. Your heart beat slowly now. Your breath came easy, too easy. You leaned back against the rock and let your head tilt upward. There were no vultures above you today. Not even the sky was interested in you anymore. You thought, just once, of the stories people told, of shootouts, of treasure, of saloons and cattle drives and brave sheriffs riding in at dawn. But you knew now that none of that mattered. The Wild West wasn't about action. It wasn't about survival of the strongest. It was about silence, about empty space, about the way wind could wear a person down, the way it carved going slowly, without rush, without mercy. On the 20th night, you didn't prepare for sleep. There was no ritual, no comfort, just you and the land and the sound of your breath. Blending into the stillness, you looked up at the stars once, pale and flickering through the dry air, and then quietly, you let your eyes close, not from despair, not from failure, but because the West had finally done what it always does. It didn't kill you with drama. It didn't end with a bang. It simply waited until you became part of it. And now, like so many who came before, you would remain absorbed into its endless horizon, your story another whisper in the wind, forgotten by morning.